I still remember the sound of the front door clicking shut every morning, the soft metallic snap that told me Daniel had left for work. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that settles in your chest and reminds you to move carefully, to speak less, to take up less space. When his car faded down the street, the house shifted with it, like comfort had clocked out for the day. I would stand there for a moment, one hand resting on the counter to steady my knees, listening to the silence stretch. That was when Emily straightened her shoulders, adjusted the warm smile she kept polished for witnesses, and stepped fully into the role she played best, the kind woman everyone believed in. The version meant just for me didn't bother with smiles. To the neighbors, she was all sunshine and soft laughter. To me, she was clipped sentences, deliberate pauses, and a kitchen that somehow forgot I existed. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old, Daniel's mother, and I live in the same house where I once packed lunches and burned pancakes and laughed too loudly on Saturday mornings. Back then, this kitchen smelled like butter and noise and life happening without asking permission. Now it smelled like fresh coffee brewed just for Emily and whoever happened to be watching, while my own stomach learned to stay quiet, like it was something shameful. None of it began sharply. It never does. When Emily first moved in, she called me Mom with a sweetness that didn't feel fake yet. She asked if I was warm enough, if my joints were acting up, if I needed anything from the store. Daniel watched us with that relieved smile sons wear when they think the hard part is over. I wanted that peace, so I leaned into it. I ignored how her kindness always arrived on schedule. The first evening I missed dinner, she said she thought I'd already eaten. Her voice sounded surprised, almost concerned. I felt foolish for bringing it up, told myself I must have forgotten to say something, blamed my age before I blamed her. I went to bed that night with a light ache in my stomach and a heavier one behind my ribs. The second time, she said she didn't want to wake me because I looked tired. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed afterward, rubbing my hands together to warm them, telling myself not to be dramatic. By the third time, there was no explanation at all. Just an empty kitchen and the low hum of the refrigerator. Daniel never noticed. He left before sunrise and came home drained, trusting without effort. Mom, Emily takes good care of you, right? He'd ask, already loosening his tie, already halfway gone. I'd nod, because correcting him felt like more work than hunger. What hurt more than the missed meals was the performance. Every afternoon, like clockwork, Emily cooked as if she were hosting a fundraiser. Pots clanged, spices bloomed, food simmered long enough for the smell to drift outside. Then the doorbell rang. Neighbors, acquaintances, people who barely knew our names. Emily greeted them like family, handing out plates piled high, talking about generosity, about how important it was to look after people, especially elders. I stood just out of sight, my back against the doorway because my legs tired easily, listening as she said, I always make extra. You never know who might need a good meal. They nodded, impressed, grateful. Mrs. Thompson once smiled at me and said, You're so lucky to have a daughter-in-law like Emily. She's such a blessing. I smiled back, the polite kind that doesn't reach your eyes, feeling my hands tremble slightly as I folded them together. Emily's fingers closed around my arm then, light but precise, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I wasn't allowed to finish. After everyone left, the house felt hollow. The fridge was nearly empty. The counters were spotless. Emily settled onto the couch, scrolling her phone like nothing had happened. There's soup in the cabinet, she said without looking up. Later, I opened the can, hesitated at the sour note and the smell, at the faded numbers I pretended not to read too closely, and closed it again. That night, I drank water and lay awake, listening to my own breathing, understanding something I hadn't wanted to name. I tried once to tell Daniel, just enough to test the ground. I said I hadn't been feeling well, that sometimes I forgot to eat. Emily laughed softly before he could answer, her hand already on his arm. She's stubborn, she said. I practically chase her with food. Daniel kissed my forehead and told me to take better care of myself. In that moment, I saw how easily truth could be dressed up and sent away. So I stopped explaining. I started watching. I noticed how Emily's kindness only appeared when there was an audience, how my hunger only existed when there were none. Hunger sharpens things. It teaches you patterns. And slowly, without drama, I understood this was never really about food. It was about being seen a certain way, about applause, about making sure everyone admired her goodness while no one noticed the quiet cost to me. Day followed day, empty dinners stacking up like unspoken words, and I realized I wasn't helpless. I was just quiet. And quiet people, when they pay attention, remember everything. I didn't mark the days, but my body did. It kept count in small, humiliating ways, how my knees stiffened after sitting too long, how the stairs felt steeper in the afternoon, how my hands sometimes shook when I reached for a glass. Mornings still began the same way, Daniel rushing out the door with his tie half straight, Emily calling after him to drive safe, her voice warm enough to convince anyone listening that this was a good home. When the door clicked shut, the air changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The rules returned. I moved slower now, partly because of age, partly because I'd learned that moving with confidence seemed to irritate Emily. She liked me careful. She liked me apologetic without words. She liked me small. She reminded me often of what she was doing for me, always casually, always when Daniel wasn't around. I paid the electric bill early, she'd say, rinsing her mug. I picked up your prescription last week. The line was crazy. Each sentence landed like a receipt slid across a counter. Kindness with strings attached. By lunchtime, she'd make herself something quick and neat, standing at the counter scrolling through her phone, crumbs scattering where I'd later wipe them away. If I asked whether she wanted me to make something for both of us, she'd smile without looking up. Don't worry about it, Mom. I've got it. The tone made it clear I didn't. Some days she left a sandwich wrapped loosely in foil on the counter, already dry by the time I noticed. Other days, nothing. When I asked, she tilted her head, eyebrows lifted, like she was genuinely puzzled. Didn't you eat earlier? I started doubting myself. That's the quiet trick of it. When the body is tired, the mind becomes easier to bend. In the afternoons, energy returned to her like a performance cue. Music on, windows open, the smell of real food filling the house's food meant for anyone but me. I'd sit in the living room pretending to read, shifting carefully to ease the ache in my back, listening as she talked on the phone about generosity, about how she believed elders deserved dignity. The words felt deliberate, like they were meant to bruise. One afternoon, I felt dizzy halfway up the stairs and had to sit down, my breath shallow, my palms slick. I told myself it was nothing. I always told myself that. Later, a woman from down the block stopped by unexpectedly. Emily didn't miss a beat. Plates appeared. Portions were generous. She made sure I was visible just enough to complete the picture. Margaret raised such a wonderful man, she said warmly. I try to take good care of her. The woman smiled at me, squeezed my hand, said I was blessed. I felt my fingers tremble in hers, not from emotion but from hunger, from the effort of standing too long without showing it. When the door closed again, Emily's smile vanished like it had never existed. You shouldn't hover like that, she said flatly. It makes people uncomfortable. That night, there was no dinner for me. Daniel came home late, tired, already talking about deadlines. Emily set a plate in front of him, full and steaming. I made tea and sat across from him, my hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. He didn't notice. He never did. I watched the way Emily refilled his glass before it was empty, the way she asked about his day with genuine interest, the way her care was always loud when it mattered. After he went to bed, she cleaned the kitchen quickly, leaving nothing behind. There's oatmeal if you're hungry, she said over her shoulder. I opened the cupboard later and stared at the box, doing quiet math in my head, how many meals missed, how many excuses made. My stomach growled softly, like it was embarrassed to speak up. I ate half a bowl and went to bed, my calves cramping as I lay down. The next morning, I overslept and missed my doctor's appointment. Emily shrugged when I mentioned it. You can reschedule. It's not like it's urgent. My joints ached more than usual as I came downstairs, gripping the banister. She glanced at me and sighed. You really should take better care of yourself, she said. At your age, it's important. The words sounded caring. The look wasn't. Something shifted then, not loudly, not all at once. I realized she wasn't forgetting to feed me. She was choosing not to. And she was careful, smart, keeping everything subtle enough that I'd look confused if I complained. I thought about telling Daniel again, about insisting this time. I could already hear how it would go, Emily softening her voice, laughing gently, turning it into concern for my memory. My stubbornness didn't have proof. I only had patterns, so I stayed quiet. I paid closer attention. Which days she cooked big meals, which days the fridge stayed bare. How she talked about money before Daniel left, how she said, I'll handle your mom's stuff, like I was a chore. I noticed my clothes hanging looser, the way I learned to sip water to quiet my stomach, the way I sat down more often without meaning to. Silence became my shield, not because I was weak, but because I was learning. And beneath the ache and careful steps, something steady took shape. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew this wasn't accidental anymore, and that understanding carried its own quiet danger. The first thing that changed wasn't Emily. It was my body. I didn't wake up one morning and feel weaker. It happened quietly, like dust settling on furniture no one touches anymore. My knees started arguing with me before I even stood up, stiff and stubborn, like they'd learned a language I hadn't. My hands shook when I poured coffee, and not the harmless kind people joke about. The kind that makes you hide your fingers in your lap so nobody asks if you're okay. I stopped telling Daniel little things. I didn't want to sound like I was collecting complaints. Emily noticed, though. She always did. She just noticed the way someone counts inventory, not concern. One afternoon, she watched me steady myself against the kitchen counter, her eyes flicking to the clock instead of my face. "You really should pace yourself," she said, voice smooth, measured. "We don't want unnecessary emergencies." The word unnecessary stayed with me all day. It followed me when I skipped lunch because the smell of food turned my stomach. It followed me when Emily reminded me, almost cheerfully, that groceries cost more lately and we all had to be mindful. It followed me when Daniel called that evening, distracted, asking if I was doing okay, and Emily answered before I could, light and quick, saying I was fine, just tired, like anyone my age would be. I listened to my life shrink into something manageable, something that didn't require attention or follow-up. That night, the cramps in my legs woke me up. I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slow, counting until the pain dulled. In the half-dark, I looked at my hands and realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me what I needed and waited long enough to hear the truth. A few days later, Emily drove me to a follow-up appointment she'd insisted wasn't urgent. In the waiting room, she filled out the paperwork for me, neat handwriting, confident answers. When the nurse called my name, Emily stood up automatically. "I'll come in," she said, already smiling. I surprised both of us. "I'll be all right," I said. My voice didn't wobble. Emily hesitated for half a second, just long enough to notice, then smiled wider. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." Inside the exam room, the doctor asked questions Emily usually answered. I spoke slowly, clearly. When I mentioned dizziness, skipped meals, how tired I'd been climbing stairs, his expression changed. Not alarmed. Interested. He adjusted his glasses and asked real questions. When he mentioned dehydration and nutrition, something tight loosened in my chest, not fear, but recognition. On the drive home, Emily was quiet. Too quiet. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel. At a red light, she sighed. "You should have told me you were feeling that bad," she said. Not apologetic. Defensive. I looked out the window. "I did," I said. She didn't respond. That evening, she made soup. Real soup. Steam rising, a bowl placed carefully in front of me just as Daniel walked in. He noticed immediately. "Smells good," he said, half focused on his phone. Emily smiled at him, that warm, practiced smile. "I'm trying to do better," she said lightly. Daniel nodded, relieved. I tasted the soup and felt my stomach twist, not from hunger, but clarity. This wasn't care. This was adjustment. Later that night, I passed the hallway and heard Emily on the phone. She didn't see me. "He's starting to notice things," she said quietly. A pause. No, not confused. Just, more aware. Another pause. "I know. I'm handling it." I went back to my room and sat down slowly. I understood then that this wasn't about food or appointments or my age. It was about control. About managing the story before anyone else could hear it. From that point on, I stopped filling in the gaps for her. When Daniel asked why I hadn't eaten much, I said, I wasn't offered much. When Emily reminded me I'd already taken my pills, I said, I wrote it down. I haven't. I started keeping notes in a small notebook tucked inside an old sewing kit no one ever opened. Times. Words. Little things that added up. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I just stopped disappearing. Emily noticed immediately. Her kindness sharpened. Her concern grew louder in public. In private, she watched me like someone checking a door they thought they'd locked. Daniel, though, started pausing. Just slightly. Once, I caught him looking at my plate longer than usual. Another time, when Emily corrected me too quickly, he frowned, then looked away like he wasn't ready to finish the thought. It wasn't support. Not yet. But it wasn't blindness either. One afternoon, Emily reached for my arm as I stood up. Careful, she said loudly. You really shouldn't be alone. Her grip lingered. I met her eyes and smiled faintly. I'm not, I said. For the first time, her smile didn't come back. And I understood something important then. She wasn't afraid of losing control. She was afraid of being seen. I didn't plan to test the silence. It tested itself. Once I stopped rushing to explain, people began filling in the gaps on their own. Emily worked harder. Her kindness became louder, almost desperate, like someone trying to drown out a sound only they could hear. She started announcing things she'd never mentioned before. What time I ate, what medicine I took, How many steps I'd walked that day, in front of Daniel. Always with that careful tone that said responsibility without affection. Daniel listened more than he spoke. That alone was new. One evening, he paused in the doorway while Emily explained my diet again, nodding as if he agreed, but his eyes drifted to my plate. There wasn't much on it. He didn't say anything, just frowned slightly, like the thought hadn't fully formed yet. Emily noticed. Her smile tightened, barely. After that, she began hovering. Not touching, not ordering, hovering. Asking questions that sounded optional but weren't. You finished already? You don't want seconds? You sure that didn't upset your stomach last time? Each question landed softly, but they stacked up. I answered honestly, briefly. Yes. No, I don't remember it bothering me. That seemed to bother her. The house felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. One afternoon, the neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, stopped by with a loaf of banana bread. Emily met her at the door, glowing, laughing, telling her how sweet it was, how lucky she was to have such thoughtful people around. Mrs. Caldwell looked past her, straight at me, and said, "You look thin, Margaret. Are they feeding you enough in here?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't accusatory. It was casual, almost joking. Emily laughed first. Too fast. "Oh, she's always been small," she said. I smiled politely and said nothing, but Daniel shifted his weight, just a little. Later that night, he asked me if I liked the soup Emily made. I told him it was fine. He waited, like he expected more. I didn't give it. That silence stretched between us, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. "If you need anything," he said finally, "you can tell me." I nodded. I know. It wasn't a lie. Knowing and believing are different things. Emily grew restless after that. She reorganized cabinets, threw away food she said was expired, moved my things without asking. When I mentioned not finding my vitamins, she said I must have misplaced them. When I said I'd left them by the sink, she smiled and said maybe I was remembering wrong. I wrote it down. Every time. Dates. Words. Who was in the room. I didn't correct her anymore. I let her be wrong out loud. The doctor's office called one morning to confirm my next appointment. Emily answered. I heard her through the thin wall. "She won't need that," she said smoothly. "We've decided to manage things at home." I stepped into the hallway and said my name. The line went quiet. Emily turned slowly. "They were just calling to check," she said. "I'll call them back." "I'll take it," I said. She hesitated. Long enough. Then handed me the phone. Her fingers were cold. The nurse sounded relieved when she heard my voice. When I hung up, Emily said nothing. That night, she barely touched her dinner. Daniel noticed. "Everything okay?" he asked her. She said she was just tired. He nodded, then looked at me again. "Mom," he said. I met his eyes. "Yes? Are you okay?" It wasn't concern. Not yet. It was uncertainty. I chose my words carefully. "I'm paying attention," I said. Emily's fork paused midair. Daniel didn't smile. "To what?" he asked. "To how things are done," I said. That was all. The next few days felt tense, like the air before a storm that never quite arrives. Emily's voice softened, but her eyes hardened. She started texting Daniel during the day, updates about me that sounded helpful and felt excessive. When he came home, he skimmed them, then asked me questions she'd already answered for him. Once, he asked why I hadn't gone for my walk. I told him Emily said it was too hot. He looked outside. It wasn't. Emily stood in the kitchen, pretending to wipe the counter. Daniel didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. I realized then that I didn't need to convince him. I just needed to stop covering for her. The truth had started doing its own work. One evening, Emily snapped. Not loudly, just enough. "You could at least appreciate the effort," she said, her voice sharp under the words. Daniel looked up. "What effort?" he asked. The question hung there. Emily laughed, a little too high. "I mean, everything," she said. "Keeping things running." I set my fork down. "No one asked you to," I said calmly. Emily stared at me. Daniel stared at her. No one spoke. After that, Emily avoided me unless someone else was around. When she did speak to me, it was careful, rehearsed. I stayed quiet. I kept my notes. I ate when food was offered and didn't when it wasn't. I stopped apologizing for space I took up. Daniel started knocking before entering my room. Once, he brought me a sandwich without saying why. Emily watched from the doorway, her face unreadable. I knew then the balance had shifted. Not in my favor yet. But no longer in hers alone. She wasn't losing control. She was losing certainty. And certainty, I had learned, was the only thing keeping her calm. Everyone still thought Emily was holding the house together. That belief didn't shatter in a single moment. It thinned out slowly, the way fog lifts when the sun doesn't rush it. Daniel didn't wake up wiser one morning. He just stopped brushing past things that had been quietly lining up for years. He began noticing how Emily answered questions that weren't hers, how she filled silences before I could speak, how my presence seemed managed instead of shared. One evening, after a dinner that looked generous but felt measured, he asked why I'd lost weight again. Emily said it was age catching up. I said some days I just wasn't hungry. He didn't laugh it off this time. He looked at my plate, then at hers, then back at me, and stayed quiet longer than usual. That pause was new. After that, he started coming home earlier without announcing it, standing near doorways, watching routines instead of assuming them, asking if I wanted coffee instead of deciding I didn't. Emily adapted fast. She always had. Larger portions when Daniel was home, softer tone. The kind of concern that performs well. But control doesn't vanish when it's observed. It sharpens. She began tightening schedules, canceling appointments I hadn't asked to move, speaking to nurses like she was my keeper rather than my family. At the clinic one afternoon, a nurse asked me how things were going at home. Emily answered instantly, smiling, explaining, filling the air. The nurse waited anyway and looked at me. I answered without drama, without accusation. I talked about routines, about how decisions had slowly stopped being mine, about how quiet becomes easier than correction. The nurse nodded and wrote something down. Emily didn't like that. On the drive home she said I was confusing people. I said I was answering questions. That was the first time I didn't soften my words to keep her calm. Daniel noticed the tension. Later that night he asked why Emily seemed unsettled whenever someone spoke to me directly. I told him stress comes from control slipping, not from truth being told. He didn't argue. He just listened. From there, things shifted in ways that couldn't be reversed. Daniel asked for records, not angrily, just methodically. Meal plans. Appointment summaries. Medication notes. Emily called it unnecessary pressure. Daniel called it being thorough. When a social worker stopped by for a routine senior wellness check, Emily stayed close, correcting my answers gently but constantly. The social worker smiled, then asked to speak with me alone for a moment. Emily froze. That short conversation didn't explode anything. It didn't need to. I spoke the way I had learned to survive, calmly, precisely, with facts instead of emotion. Portion sizes. Limited choices. How independence narrows without permission being taken outright. The social worker listened, not shocked, just attentive. Later she asked Daniel why my autonomy had shrunk so quickly. He didn't have an answer that held. Consequences didn't arrive with sirens. They came with paperwork, with recommendations, with words like oversight and consent. Emily wasn't accused. She was exposed by contrast. Daniel took time off work. He watched more than he spoke. He noticed how Emily hovered when he was home and relaxed when he wasn't. How I waited before opening cabinets. How I checked faces before making small decisions. He asked why I asked permission for things no one else did. Emily said she was just trying to help. Daniel said help doesn't feel like supervision. The house grew colder after that, not loud, just tense. Emily grew defensive, careful in public, sharp in private. Daniel insisted on shared decisions, documented plans, outside support. Emily said she felt misunderstood, said no one appreciated how much she'd done. Daniel told her misunderstanding isn't the same as harm. She went quiet then, the way people do when explanations stop working. A few nights later, she packed a bag. She stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, said she needed space, said she never thought it would come to this. Daniel didn't stop her. He didn't chase her either. When the door closed, the house didn't feel empty. It felt settled. In the weeks that followed, Daniel apologized in fragments. Not dramatically, not all at once. He said he should have paid attention sooner. I told him guilt doesn't repair time, awareness does. He asked what I wanted next, to stay, to move, to get help elsewhere. I told him I wanted choice. He nodded, like he was finally hearing the full sentence. We made plans together. Emily tried to explain herself later, said her intentions had been good. I told her intentions don't erase impact. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. I moved into a smaller place where doors were knocked on and questions were asked instead of assumed. My body changed before my thoughts did. I noticed my shoulders weren't always tight. My breathing slowed when I ate. Hunger stopped feeling like something I had to negotiate. Daniel visited often, sometimes talkative, sometimes quiet. He said I seemed lighter. I told him dignity does that to a person. Emily remained part of his life, but the balance had shifted. Boundaries replaced control. Oversight replaced silence. I didn't win by fighting. I won by stepping out of the performance. By letting truth surface without pushing it. Silence had protected them for years. It doesn't do that anymore. Now it protects me.